The way that we make things and create things is if I build something today with my son, if I build Battleship or something out of Legos, once we're finished with it, I don't have to maintain its existence anymore. Until somebody like steps on it, it's going to retain its existence. When it comes to the creation process, what our mystical sages inform us is that all of reality is not only created by God, but it's constantly being sustained by God at every moment. It's kind of like a movie projector constantly. You need that constant light hitting the film that projects this image on a screen. And if that light were to go out for 1 second, the whole thing just sort of disappears and goes back to nothingness.
Beneath the surface of our everyday lives, an unfathomable, unseen force shapes our experiences. Ancient wisdom speaks to this deeper truth, revealing how divine energy sustains and connects everything, even in this modern chaotic world. My guest on today's show is Rabbi Pinchas Taylor. He's an author, speaker, and spiritual teacher known for making Jewish wisdom accessible to those of all faiths. From best-selling books like Pillars of Faith and A Jewish Guide to the Mysterious, to frequent media appearances on the national news, he bridges the gap between timeless teachings and contemporary challenges. In this episode, we dive into the mystical insights of Hebrew letters and the spiritual mechanics of creation. The rabbi reveals how nothing is actually random, how teachings from the distant past still shape our world, and how understanding the divine blueprint can transform our daily life. We also explore the 10 Commandments versus the Noahide Laws, the cosmic meaning behind biblical stories, and the hidden codes within sacred texts. This discussion will reveal how aligning with spiritual truth can unlock a deeper sense of purpose, connection, and clarity in your life. So without any further ado, on with the show. Rabbi Pinchas, welcome to the show, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
So we met because I contacted you out of the blue, and then we started meeting, and I've gotten some really great coaching from you. So thank you for that. And so we're like old friends now, and not just meeting for the first time on this interview. So thank you for taking the time to do this. I'd love to start off this interview by asking you what appealed to you about Judaism, and we went from not observant as a teenager to observant, and there was a turning point for you. There was something that drew you in. So what was that?
Well, it does feel like we're old friends, and I'm glad to be able to share this little bit of story with you. I can't say that it was a particular moment or incident or meeting or situation, which is usually what people think when it comes to this sort of thing. It was a little bit out of the blue, actually, similar to the way we met, just sort of divine intervention, if you will. Mm-hmm. So basically what happened was I entered into high school, and in ninth grade, there was a class that the presentation that we were supposed to give is, what do you want to be when you grow up, and to give a presentation based on sort of the pathway of how one would get to that place. And I never really thought about it in a serious way. It was just coming into high school, and when I thought about it, the direction that I was kind of led to was to become a rabbi. And it kind of made sense to me. I always liked spirituality, Judaism in particular, but spirituality in general. I always liked people. I always liked teaching, and I always liked learning. So, like, if you stir that in a pot, rabbi seems like the ideal job that comes out of that. And so, really, I decided that I wanted to be a rabbi before deciding that I wanted to be observant. And then through like the exploration of what different kinds of rabbis are out there, it led me more to observance. I had been in a Chabad Hebrew school when I was 7 years old, and I had been bar mitzvahed in a conservative temple, and so those were the first two places that I went to explore, since I had already sort of a familiarity with them and a connection with them. And it didn't take very long, actually, to sort of decide on the Chabad route, because Chabad, for me, felt like a very strong connection with tradition. Like they weren't cutting any corners. They were living the Torah as the Torah was given, but also very engaged in the modern world. They weren't cloistered off. They weren't closed-minded towards other people that didn't have that lifestyle, and I found that very attractive. And then the more I started reading the writings of the Rebbe that had been translated into English at the time, the more I just couldn't get enough. It was like a kid in the candy store just finding the gold, you know. So that was sort of that's what brought me in that direction.
Mm. Right. And now you're known by some as America's rabbi. So how did you go from just being a rabbi with your congregation or the people that you serve to reaching people throughout the country, maybe even internationally, giving keynote speeches, having a popular YouTube channel, being on TV, getting all these media appearances and so forth? How did you go from, there to...
Well, so it's interesting because when I was growing up and when I was kind of finding my way to Judaism, and as far as religious observance was, this is about age 15. I became fully observant, and at the time, I almost looked at my background as a handicap because when you start rabbinical school at age 18 and all of the other students have been studying their entire life, well, you feel behind. I felt behind. I felt like if I had only been born in a different situation, maybe I'd be where I would like to be. And and what ended up happening, and I only really kind of settled on this in hindsight, was that upbringing and that whole process of going through everything and learning how to maintain relationships and so forth was actually, it went from becoming a handicap and a hindrance to something that was extremely helpful. And it made me, I believe, more relatable, more accessible, and I just had an easier time in general connecting with people, both of the Jewish faith who were not yet observant and those outside of the Jewish world. And so coming from that upbringing of having lots of non-Jewish friends and being involved in the non-Jewish world, growing up through public school and everything like that, I always was curious and fascinated by Judaism's embrace of those outside of the Jewish world. And that Judaism was unique and didn't mandate it's our way or the highway, that it embraced all of humanity to live according to a moral and spiritual code. Again, not with all of the ins and outs that a Jewish person is responsible for, but maintaining a spiritual connection and living a life of morality. I always thought that was important for me to be demonstrating, and I included my non-Jewish friends and non-observant friends and family members and so forth in anything that I was doing. And they really liked it. They really appreciated that sort of inclusion, that engagement, not sort of what you might have expected of being sort of pushed away. And so just thought that engagement, I think, followed me throughout the years. And then with the advent of the internet and social media, and as things developed, I started using those resources to reach more people. And then that really just kind of became my real focus and passion, was explaining Torah in a clear and thorough way, spirituality in a thorough and clear way, but in a way that a secular non-Jewish person could enjoy, appreciate, and gain from.
Yeah, and you make it relevant to current events so that, let's say, Fox News or some other morning or nightly news program will have you on to comment on a particular current event from a Jewish perspective. And I think that's quite amazing and unusual. There are a lot of rabbis, but not very many of them get called again and again by news anchors or news producers to comment.
Well, I think that's part of the beauty of Torah that a lot of people maybe are not aware of, is the idea that these concepts are universal. They're applicable at all places and at all times. And so I remember this thing kind of hitting me. It was a few years ago. It was when when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock on stage at the award ceremony. And it was like a big shock, and everyone, even people who had really loved Will Smith until that point and loved his acting, and like they were really taken aback. It was like just completely, and so I remember talking to Fox News at the time about what atonement or forgiveness from his fans and what that might look like for the average American. And it just applied these ancient ideas, this ancient wisdom, this ancient Hebrew wisdom, I guess you could say, to the modern world in the clearest, most bizarre but relevant way. And that same thing can be done really across the board. That the wisdom, the spiritual wisdom of the Torah is relevant to all people at all times and all situations.
Yeah. So I remember that situation with Will Smith, and it felt like a setup. I don't know. There was something about that it felt like this was preordained, predetermined, not just like from God's perspective, because He knows everything that's going to happen and everything is orchestrated from above, but that this was like predetermined or some sort of karmic thing between Will and Chris that might have been like from a past life or something. It just or might have just been something that they I don't know. It just wasn't random. It felt like.
Well, nothing's random.
Yeah.
As far as what the manifestations in prior lives might have been, that we can speculate about that. But the outcome of what the process of getting back in the good graces of the American people and the American fan in this particular case. Is still the path that anyone would go on when it comes to what's the pathway to forgiveness in any relationship, and the pathway to reconciliation or atonement in any situation. And we sort of discussed what that might look like. But again, this is the stage of the Oscars is not exactly the place where you'd think that Torah is going to be something that's expressed, but there's a Torah lesson that can be brought out from that interaction, as negative as it was, and what our reconciliation point can be with accepting Will Smith back into the good graces of our hearts as fans.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Ten Commandments and the Noahide Laws, and how these are not the same. And people think that the Ten Commandments, that's what we're bound by as humanity, but there's some distinctions there around some of those commandments are actually meant for Jews and not just for everybody, like honoring Shabbat, the Sabbath is for Jews, and non-Jews are not supposed to observe all the rules of Shabbat. So could you explain how this came about, that there are these different laws from the Ten Commandments and why the Ten Commandments are specifically for Jews?
Sure. So the path is actually a bit mystical, if you will. And so it really starts off with Adam and Eve, the very first couple that are described in the Torah. And so they're given 6 laws, 6 moral laws to follow that are hinted at in the book of Genesis when the Torah uses the Hebrew words that talk about not eating from the tree of knowledge. There are words in there that allude to the 6 laws of the moral code. And that's to worship God, to not curse God, not to steal, not to murder, not to commit illicit relationships, and to establish courts of justice. At that point in time, they weren't eating animals yet, and so there was no need to have a commandment to not eat the limb of a live animal, because they weren't eating animals at that point anyway. So in any case, if Adam and Eve had done what they needed to do and not eaten from the tree of knowledge, they would have perfected the world right then and there, and the world would have entered into this bliss of what we would call now messianic times, where it's world peace and godliness is openly revealed everywhere. And unfortunately, they chose the wrong thing, and then now humanity has to sort of collectively correct the world one step at a time, one piece at a time. And so 10 generations go by, humanity is collectively being led in the wrong directions, all sorts of immorality, not creating a civilization. Noah's generation comes along. God tells Noah, I'm sorry, but this world thing is not working out. This humanity thing is not working out. Everyone's become corrupt and immoral. Your family is good and safe, but everyone else, I'm going to start fresh. Everyone's going to come from you. You're going to be sort of the new Adam and Eve. And that's what happens. And after the flood, God gives a new covenant or reestablishes this covenant to Noah to live a moral life with those 6 laws that we had mentioned. And he gives them a 7th law. And after, you'll notice in the Bible, it says that people would be able to eat meat. And then the commandment is just to not eat the limb of a live animal, meaning that the animal has to be dead. It's like the most basic kosher law, if you will, given to humanity. And that's the 7th of the 7 laws of Noah. And that's where it gets its namesake. The 7 Noahide Laws means the 7 laws that were given to Noah. And since all of humanity is a descendant of Noah, that is the initial moral code that is obligatory on everybody for all time. And so as the generations continue, people begin, again, going in the wrong direction. People begin forgetting about God again, except for a few people here and there. Most people are not continuing in the proper path. The very first person to discover God on his own and to preach that to the world is Abraham. And so at that moment, after God tests Abraham a number of times, God decides that through Abraham is going to come a group amongst humanity that will act as be a priest to the nations of the world. In other words, there'll be a group that God is going to give a bit of extra instructions to be examples, to be the clergy, if you will, for planet Earth. And that through that family and through that leadership, the entire world will be guided in the right path. Because it's not working out for most people to live an upright and moral life. And so you'll have this clergy, this example, because everyone needs a good example in their life. And that will be the route forward. And so Abraham gives birth to Isaac and Jacob, the 12 tribes. They go into Egypt. They are enslaved for several hundred years, and then they come out as a nation. The Jewish nation, the Jewish people are created after leaving Egypt, after suffering in the crucible of Egypt for several hundred years. They are emerging as a unique entity, the Jewish nation, the Jewish people. And 50 days later, they stand at the foot of Mount Sinai, all together, and receive the law, the instructions that God is going to bestow upon them to become this nation of priests, the holy nation, the clergy for the world at large. And that was the goal, and that's the goal that we aspire to in the Jewish community, is to live an upright moral life, to also incorporate some of the spiritual and ritualistic things that bring spirituality to even some mundane aspects of life. And that's supposed to be a good example, a light to the nations, as Isaiah calls it, that motivates and inspires the nations of the world, everybody, to collectively look towards God. And so the commandments that are given at Sinai are the entirety of the Torah, all the instructions, all 613 commandments. But those are sort of summarized in the etched writings in the etched stones of the Ten Commandments. And so, yes, there are commandments in there that are not talking specifically about morality, like observing the Sabbath. You can be a moral person, an upright person, and not keep the Sabbath. And so those commandments that are outside of the scope of morality, that are beyond civilization building and creating a vessel in this world for God, those are relegated just to the Jewish community. Since it was just the Jewish community, the Jewish nation that was standing at Sinai, they are the only ones that are obligated to keep it, right? They can't. If someone living in China can't be obligated to keep a law that's given that they knew nothing about, they didn't accept, I didn't agree to this, I didn't sign on to this. The Jews signed on to it. They stood before Mount Sinai. They were given the instruction, and they're the ones that maintain this obligation. The rest of humanity is still under the obligation solely of the Noahide Code, making a moral society that is based on revealing God, living a godly life in this world.
Yeah. So the souls that received through Moses the Torah and those 10 commandments, when God spoke the first commandment, all these souls couldn't handle the energy of that, and then they just all died. Their souls left their body, and I guess the angels were sent to put the souls back in the bodies so that like all the Jewish people wouldn't just be dead. So can you expound on that? Because there's hints in the Torah, in the Bible, about some of these things, but a lot of it is not in there at all. And yet it's common knowledge for every Jew to know these things. Is that because it was in the oral Torah that was given at the same time that was commanded to not be written down, that only the written Torah was to be written down? So could you expound on that?
Sure. So at Sinai, these are great questions. I think that your audience may never had exposure to. The all of the written laws in the Torah were accompanied by oral explanation, and there are a lot of commandments that are completely ununderstandable as far as what you're supposed to do without the oral accompaniment. I mean, the Sabbath is a perfect example because the Torah tells us that you have to keep the Sabbath. It's one of the 10 commandments. And it also says that the penalty for not keeping the Sabbath back in those days was if you willingly, purposefully violated the Sabbath, it could be the death penalty. Assuming it was malicious and you had witnesses, but the Torah doesn't explain very much what's considered working on the Sabbath. Like such a severe penalty, but not specifying. Okay, well, how does one work? Does work mean like plowing your field? Does it mean walking 20 miles, or is walking 2 miles, or what if you like walking? Like what are the specifications of what's considered work? And we've talked a lot about these, over time. But once you understand the creative labor aspect and what the categories of labor are, it begins to make a lot more sense. Okay, this would be something that would be violating that, and why, and kind of tracing it. But you need an oral law to set out what exactly the parameters are in the observance of the Sabbath. And really all of the commandments fall in that same category. Jewish people notoriously have the mezuzah affixed to their door. Mezuzah is a parchment that goes on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. Well, what's supposed to be written in that mezuzah, in that scroll? Where does it even say the word scroll? It just says, write these words on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. How is that meant to be done? Which words are we talking about? Where do you place it? All of the details that go into that are from the oral tradition. And so without the oral tradition, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to fulfill any of the commandments, because the parameters, the specifications of fulfillment versus non-fulfillment can sometimes be a very fine line. You got to know what do I need to do in order to fulfill this thing. right? To forge that connection with God. And so what happened at Mount Sinai, not only in the legal sense of finding out the parameters of all the laws, but all of the ways, the methodologies of extrapolating from the written text what was going on, what's the greater part of the story. What those lessons, those abilities to be able to derive from the Torah were also given at Mount Sinai. And so things like where you have two words that are found in different verses, well, you can learn something sometimes because the same word is used over here and it's used over there. And so the parameters that were used over here also apply over there because that same word is used. The Torah is very specific. The written Torah is very specific in the wording that it uses as well. So if it uses a less common word versus a more common way of saying the same thing, there's something that word is teaching, or that extra letter, or that larger than usual letter, or that smaller than usual letter. There's always something being taught in the precision of the wording of the Torah. The written Torah is kind of like a computer code. It's like a graphic user interface for reality. And so what was taking place at Mount Sinai that you alluded to is derived from the oral tradition, from the wording that's used in those passages that describe the giving of the Torah. And our tradition teaches that things that were normally heard were seen, and things that were normally seen were heard. Like the entire physical reality in that locale was completely overturned, completely upside down. And God starts giving the instructions, and the voice, if you will, of God is so powerful, so overpowering that their souls were so elated that they just jumped out of their bodies. It wasn't out of pain; it was out of joy. It was like the soul connecting to its source, its maker. It jumps right into it, and so there had to be essentially a miracle to maintain the souls, to put the souls back in the bodies. And then Moses winds up giving the remainder of the commandments after the first two. So these are wild ideas and accountings that not only apply to when the Torah was given, but all of the stories of the Bible to give us a bigger framework as to what was going on in each of these situations. Questions as simple as, okay, well, if the Bible says that Adam and Eve had two children, Cain and Abel, then where'd the rest of humanity come from? Things as mundane, but where did they come from? Well, the oral tradition says that each of them were born with a twin sister, and they sort of married the sister from the other, and that was permitted in the original generation just to get the population going. And so if you just read the text of the written Bible, I don't know that, but so there's an oral tradition accompanying what's going on in each story, each segment. So not only for the legal stuff, but also for just the happenings that are described in the Torah.
Yeah, and the spiritual meanings and the secrets that are embedded in the use of certain words in the what's called the gematria. The numbers associated with each letter, when you add them up, equals a number that has spiritual significance, and there are coded messages in that too, even where the dots are placed in the words. It's all quite astounding. Like I just recently learned that about the gematria, the numbers of the names of Jacob and Esau, and how there's the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, embedded essentially 8 times in Jacob's, or 7 times, sorry, in Jacob's name, 8 times in Isaac's name, and because there's 8 times the gematria number of the tetragrammaton, 4-letter name of God, equals exactly Isaac's name. And then it equals 7 times the tetragrammaton in Jacob's name, and there's 1 occurrence in Esau's name, and then 7 occurrences of the word what is it, tumot? which the impurity. What's that word in Hebrew?
Yeah, tuma,
Tuma.
tuma.
So
Yeah,
there's 7 times impurity, 1 time of the 4-letter name of God in Esau's. So he wasn't pure evil. And Jacob went to make peace with this guy who was his mortal enemy that was coming with 400 men to kill him. Instead of him preparing for war, and he would have won and he would have slaughtered his brother Esau, he chose to humble himself and make peace with the guy and essentially bribe him and all these things. I learned all this stuff just recently, and it all comes from, like, all these secrets come from the gematria of the names, and it makes so much more sense that why would he bow down to his evil brother, and instead of just wiping the guy off the face of the earth.
right.
He was restoring some lost part of himself, and there were 7 mentions of my brother Esau, and then there's one mention at the end where it's the 8th time, and he just calls him my brother. Esau disappeared, and it's just now all these 7 levels of impurity were removed, and now what's left is the purity of the Creator. It's just like mind
Oh,
blowing,
it's
amazing.
totally, totally. I was talking to some seminary girls last week about how really what the Torah is and what the world is like the movie The Matrix. And the more a person learns Torah, the more you kind of realize sort of the behind the scenes of the Matrix. So in the Matrix movie, right, you're given the choice to choose which pill you want to take. Are you happy living sort of in the fake world and just go through the motions of what pass through the superficial veneer of what reality seems to be? Or do you want to really see what reality is going on? And it's different from the Matrix in the sense that the real reality isn't gruesome and terrible. It's actually what the Torah is describing is what's going on in the spiritual worlds, in order to, like, what these spiritual paradigms are that are taking place as represented in these stories. So on the one hand, these things are taking place in the physical world, right? Adam and Eve really did exist. The Garden of Eden was a physical place, and all of these things happened, like as the Torah says they did, in time and space, but they were also the unfolding of spiritual paradigms that we can gain access to through Jewish mysticism. And it's a fascinating thing to see. This is not just a story of 2 brothers that had some fights their whole life and there was a big struggle. These are like worlds colliding and rectifying each other and perfecting and going into the whole rectification of the world as exemplified and personified by these key figures.
Yeah.
So it just completely reshapes the way that we live our lives when we delve into it in this sort of way, looking at it with this sort of lens.
Yeah, and the term tikkun olam, which is very popular, well-known Hebrew expression, means the rectification or healing of the world, and that's all of our job to do, regardless of whether someone is Jewish or not. And Jacob is a prime example of somebody who took that very seriously. Like, he could have obliterated his evil brother and it was totally justified, and it would rid the world of this darkness and this hatred for no reason, really. But then the little spark of purity would be lost too, that was within Esau, that could have been reclaimed and restored. That tikkun olam, that rectification of the world, that would have been an incredible missed opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really cool stuff. And when you mentioned the Matrix, I was just thinking about that green code going across the screen, like dripping off the screen, and it was
yeah.
Japanese kanji, but in reality, it's Hebrew letters, right? Those are the energy packets of creation. You want to say
That's
anything
right.
further about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Jewish mysticism describes the creation and sustaining of the world in a similar way to the way we sort of think about it scientifically. So you have 100 plus elements, and that is the fabric of reality, if you will. That these elements, these atoms combine to form molecules, and ultimately different substances and physical entities are all created and based on these essential elements. And so, in a similar way, the Jewish mysticism describes that the Hebrew letters that are spoken into existence by God at the beginning of creation, in these 10 utterances in the beginning of the book of Genesis, when God says, let there be light, and God says, let there be sun, moon, and stars, and goes through the entire first week in the scope of 10 utterances, that those letters actually are the letters themselves are sort of like the periodic table of elements, the spiritual periodic table, and they combine to form different words, which creates the spiritual essence of everything in physical reality. And so when these letters get together, that form the letter rock, that form the word rock, that those three Hebrew letters are the spiritual essence of this thing that takes on the physical nature of a rock and chair and wall and river and mountain, and every word is essentially a combination of these Hebrew letters that God is bringing into existence. But it is interesting enough to take it to the next step. The way that we make things and create things is that if I build something today, with my son, if I build battleship or something out of Legos, once we're finished with it, so that's it. I don't have to maintain its existence anymore. It's like that until somebody like steps on it, it's going to retain its existence. When it comes to the creation process, what our mystical sages inform us is that all of reality is not only created by God, but is constantly being sustained by God at every moment. It's kind of like a movie projector constantly, and you need that constant light hitting the film that projects this image on a screen. And if that light were to go out for 1 second, the whole thing just sort of disappears and goes back to nothingness. Well,
So
reality kind
60
of
frames
functions.
a second, God is making sure that every frame is showing up, because if
Yeah,
he took his attention away from it, or his intention was no longer to maintain it, then all of reality would shatter instantly.
it's right. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to think about. That the nature of nothingness is to remain nothing unless there's an active force making it become somethingness. And so the divine creation, which is something from nothing, is very different than our creation, which is something from something. And so that's why there's this constant need for this investment of godly energy into the creation process. So aside from being something that's mystical and fascinating, it actually has a lot of practical relevance to our lives as well, because if everything that happens is divinely orchestrated, if God is sustaining the world, then I can feel a certain sense of security that even if things don't appear to be going the way that I hoped or thought they were going in my life, I know that God is very much in control. It doesn't just leave the world to its own devices to run on autopilot. God's constantly investing God's energy into the reality that we see before us.
Yeah. So that means that in every circumstance that might be seen as just an unfortunate random act of violence or tragedy, or just something seemingly horribly wrong, or something just chaotic and random, it's not random. It's not left to its own devices. Everything has the hand of God in it. And because the Creator is kind and beneficent and loving, and always wants to do good to us and for us. Therefore, there must be a blessing in whatever storm we are seemingly suffering from at the moment. Do you want to expound on that?
Well, that's certainly the case. We don't often, in fact, sometimes we may never see how that actually plays itself out. Sometimes we get sometimes we get a little bit of an understanding in hindsight, where we'll be going through something in our own lives that seems like it's going to be the end of us, and it seems like the worst thing in the here and the now. Then 10 years later, 20 years later, you look back and you say, wow, if not for that moment, I wouldn't be at this great status that I am today. It had that thing that I thought was, again, the end of the world at that time, had that not happened to me, and had that situation not come. And so sometimes we are actually privy to understanding a little bit of God's ways in hindsight.
Yeah.
And
I remember, by the way, my
yeah.
chiropractor telling me, who actually has been a student of Kabbalah for many years, for decades. He told me that his cancer, he got close to death in the 2007, 2008 timeframe. He was very close to not making it through, and he wouldn't change a thing. If he had to, choose between that and some other version of reality, he wouldn't change anything, because it made him better. It brought him closer to the Creator. It made his life much more meaningful, even though it was horrific to go through at the time. And that's amazing that he has that bigger picture view, perspective on things.
Absolutely. Those are the people that I think are often the most inspiring, are the ones that are just completely in the zone despite all of the challenges that are going on with them. Well, there's an analogy that I like to think about when just thinking about this sort of why bad things happen to good people, which again, on an emotional level, we can never understand, and it doesn't seem that way, and we're not trying to just sort of whitewash people's pain. That's not the goal over here. But from a strictly philosophical standpoint, something that we can kind of wrap our head around a little bit to understand the way that God works in that sense is, I remember very vividly my great grandmother's home. She passed away when I was about 13, but I remember as a child going to visit her, and in the entranceway to her little condo, she had this. They used to be popular, not so popular anymore. It was like a needlepoint work, where there was this picture of mountains and a river and trees, but it was all made through like needle stitchings. And so this is a beautiful picture. And if you were to take that picture off the wall and look at the back, it's complete chaos. Right from the back, looks like, oh my God, like it made no sense. It looked like nothing. It just zigzags and like just nothing. It looked ugly. It looked disgusting. Nothing you would want to hang on your wall. But that same exact picture, looked at from the front view, looked pristine, looked perfect. Everything symmetrical and exactly as it needed to be. And so we, human beings in the physical world, we kind of see things through like the back of the picture, where everything looks chaotic and everything looks discombobulated and zigzag. Nothing seems to make sense. No cause, no effect. Everything's, just all over the place. And when you look at it, that same thing from the front view, which we will be privy to, just maybe not in our physical lives and our physical selves, when we look at the picture through that lens, through the front of it, from God's lens, it's like everything is exactly as it needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So even small things that seem to go awry, like glitches in the internet connection when you're trying to do a podcast interview, or technical difficulties before the call starts, or the
Yeah,
hard drive crashes. These sorts of things
it's breaking up a bit.
these glitches that you get with, like, we're having glitches right now. They can be explained away spiritually with, let's say, Mercury is in retrograde, which it is right now. And that's true. And things do kind of go haywire. Technology and communication tends to kind of go off the rails during Mercury in retrograde. But it's also, there's a higher level truth that God runs everything. And so you have this natural law of, like, hey, Mercury's in retrograde, prepare for a lot of chaos. But then you've got
Right.
this higher level of God has everything under control and everything has a purpose and a reason. And so when all this stuff was going wrong with computer technology and stuff, and so our interview ended up starting a half hour later because my wife's interview started a half hour later, and they were back to back, and it was all like glitch after glitch after glitch for a half hour prior to Orion's podcast interview. So to me, there seems like there's a lesson here that I was meant to get. And then I start meditating on that, and like, oh, actually, this is something I'm meant to bring up in this interview. Is this thing of, like, Mercury retrograde is a thing, sure, but you need to operate more from this higher spiritual principle, which in Judaism is referred to as the tree of life, whereas the tree of knowledge has a lot of, like, true stuff in it in terms of how the world works, the good and the bad, the duality, light and the dark, and all that. But there's this higher principle called the tree of life where everything is a miracle. And rather than trying to predict the future through divination, through tarot cards and astrology and reading your horoscope and paying attention to whether, what planet is in retrograde or not, and then making your decisions based on that, then you can disconnect from that reality and connect to the tree of life reality that everything is a miracle. And your life is so much richer and miraculous then. So can you expound a bit more on that?
Absolutely. So, getting back to our matrix analogy, I think would be a good starting point, because this creation, this universe that God created, this physical reality, which seems in many ways infinite. I mean, 90 billion light years in the observable universe. That number is so unfathomably large, it might as well be infinite. But this reality of existence is something that it's kind of like, these are the rules that God set in the program. And so if the matrix is a computer program and this physical world is a computer program, we always have to remember that there is a computer programmer that really is above and in control of the program at the end of the day. So left to its own devices, the program will work according to the way that it's been programmed to do. When I throw a rock up in the air, it's going to fall down because that's embedded in the program. That is the way that the rules sort of work. Could there be a need to suspend the rock in the air, or that the rock turn to fire, or some other sort of outside of the matrix, outside of the computer program way? Well, yeah, we might call that a miracle. But that is something that it just means it's not frequent, and the computer programmer is interacting in a way that doesn't normally interact. So what that means for us, in a lot of people ask me, do Jews believe in karma? And well, if by the premise of karma you mean that whatever you put out into the universe comes back to you. So if you put good out there, good comes back to you. If you put bad out there, bad comes back to you. Well, then yes, there is this idea of measure for measure, of tit for tat, that what you do ultimately, there's one caveat to that, though, and this is sort of the limitations of karma, is because from a strictly karmic thinking, and that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, which, by the way, is just a physics model of a spiritual principle, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The reason that it exists in physics is because this spiritual principle of measure for measure exists. That's just like the lower parallel of that.
Yeah. Cause and effect. Yeah.
Cause and effect. Yeah. So in that model, if all of reality was strictly the matrix or strictly the karmic universe, then if I do something that I'm not supposed to do, well, sooner or later that bad stuff's coming back to me. The missing element is you forget about the computer program, or in the language of Judaism, you forget about the concept of teshuvah, of repentance. Because what repentance does is it transcends the matrix of reality. It transcends the physical world. We reestablish and reaffirm our connection with God. We never lose our connection with God, but this brings out for ourselves that connection that we had from the get-go. And when I connect with God, who is beyond time and space, well, that negative thing never happened. Mm-hmm. If I repent to God about something that I've done in the past that wasn't the right thing to do, if I do tshuva properly, if I repent properly, return to God properly, that event never happened. It's wiped away. And so the timeline that comes out from that also never happened. And all the negative results that resulted from that as ripple effects never come out from that, never existed. And so if I go to the programmer who programmed this system, well, he can override the system. It's like a miracle. It's kind of like, when if you ever have a discrepancy, like you need to change your flight. You paid this amount for your flight and you need to change tickets, and you call up JetBlue or whatever it is, and you ask to speak to the representative, and they say, well, there's going to be this fee, and you can only change this, and these are all the rules of changing the flight. So what does I always say, like, what does a good Jew always do? Right? Let me speak to your supervisor. And we go right, and we won't stop at the next supervisor. You go to the next you go all the way to the CEO of the airline if you have to override it. I understand that this is the system. I understand that, right? This is our policy. This is our system. And they try to put it in the computer. It won't let me do it. Well, find me someone that can override it. So find me someone that has the override code. And so whether Mercury is in retrograde or any other aspect of the universe is set up in a way that is not to our favor, if we connect ourselves with the source of the computer program, we go to the programmer himself, then that system can be overridden. And we shouldn't confine ourselves to whatever my zodiac is, whatever my nature and nurture is. God can set an entire new path that wasn't perhaps destined for the person at the get-go. God can rewrite based on our teshuvah and connecting with him in a whole renewed sort of way. We can renew and restore a whole different destiny than the one that we were going on until this point.
Yeah, and this relates also to timelines and the multiverse and everything, because you have all these different realities all happening simultaneously, and there's disclosure from the light and disclosure from the dark about this in mainstream media and the entertainment complex and so forth. So there are godless movies, Marvel movies, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and like really dark, horrific movies that don't have any architect, master of the universe, God component at all. It's just to convey, we live in a multiverse, or to convey, yes, there are many, many timelines to choose from, but hey, who's who's the programmer here? There is a programmer. Right. Go straight to the programmer. Don't deal with intermediaries. Don't try and divinate or talk to the dead to try and figure out how to like sidestep some issues or whatever. Go straight to the top. And I love that teshuvah, actually, the word means, the Hebrew word means return. It's, talked about as repentance in popular culture, but it's actually return, because we're going back to God. Which is where we came from. And that's outside of time and space, and that rewrites all the timeline and everything that you're on. And it's just incredible. It's amazing.
100%.
Yeah. So
100%.
let's talk for a minute about necromancy, talking to the dead. I've had psychics on this show, for example, psychic mediums, which, that by definition, they talk to the dead. And there are psychics who have psychic abilities that are not doing mediumship. There's divination. There's like tarot cards and things like that. There's astrology. There's all sorts of stuff that is, in my understanding, as I go deeper into Judaism, it's forbidden, and actually, it's also forbidden for out of the 7 Noahide laws, isn't it?
Yeah, it's these sorts of activities are definitely things that need to be avoided, and there's really 2 reasons. One is deeper than the other. So the basic reason is because, especially nowadays, the vast majority of these sorts of people are actually charlatans. So if just statistically speaking, if I'm walking down one major street in South Florida that has 50 psychic fair palm reading stores available, it can be assumed that most, if not all of them, are just charlatans. But even if we knew 100% that this person was legit and they really could speak to the dead, or they really could lay out the tarot cards and let you know what's going to happen next week, next month, next year, it's something that needs to be avoided, and it's commanded in the Torah to avoid it, based on a verse that says in Hebrew, Tamim tihya im Hashem alekecha, you shall be pure and earnest with the Lord your God. And what that means is that these tools are ultimately going to either eradicate our free will, which is the whole point that God brings us to this world for, to have free will and to make decisions based on free will, or they drop, more importantly, they drop God from the picture. They wind up dropping God from the picture. So, as an example, if I apply for a job, and they get back to me and they say, we're going to let you know next week whether or not you got this job that you applied for. So rather than pray to God, I decide I'm going to go to my local tarot card reader, and they're going to look next week. Am I going to get the job, or am I not going to get the job? Well, if they tell me that I am going to get the job, well, I'm not going to bother praying to God for it, because I already know that I'm getting it. And if they tell me I'm not going to get the job, I'm going to say, well, I'm not going to waste my time praying to God, because I know I'm not going to get it. And so what happens inevitably is that God is dropped from the picture. God is meant to be the source of everything. And the preservation of free will as well is also an issue. If I have indisputable proof that there's an afterlife, or that there's something higher that comes from a place that is elsewhere besides faith, or faith based on reason, but faith nonetheless. If I have absolute proof, well, I'm not really in the realm of free will anymore. I'm kind of like, how could I do the wrong thing now? Because I know with 100% certainty that there is something more to this, and the whole purpose is to be in this free-willed environment and to utilize the 5 senses that we've been given to sort of process reality, to use explicitly those 5 senses to interact with the reality that we have and make the right decisions based on those things. So again, it's the eradication of free will, and it's the dropping God from the picture that becomes problematic for these particular matters. So even if, which would be rare anyway, but even if you knew that this person was 100% legit, that's why it would be forbidden still to go, according to the Torah, to these types of people.
Yeah. An analogy that comes to mind is reading the Wikipedia page of a movie before you go see the movie. You've just ruined the movie.
Right. That's right.
So don't play with that stuff. Go direct to God with your questions, your problems, your feelings of loss and lack and chaos and all that sort of stuff, and don't work through an intermediary, because that's a false god. Whoever you've elevated to that status is now your go-to instead of the master of the universe, and that's idolatry. That's very dangerous. And so this is I think a very spiritual awakened time for humanity, where a lot of people are starting to see the glitches in the matrix. They're getting very excited about it, and it's very tempting to go see psychics and go to witchcraft stores or whatever and get tarot decks and all these sorts of things, and it's dangerous. It's very dangerous.
It certainly is.
Yeah. So I know we're at time here, so if we can leave our listener or viewer with one last quick nugget of wisdom, and then your contact details if they wanted to sign up for your ARC program to learn more Jewish wisdom that's made accessible to non-Jews, which is an amazing thing. Thank you for making that your mission in the world. Where do they go for that? But first, the wisdom nugget.
So somebody asked me a few years ago if I had the entire world standing in front of me and I can deliver one message, what do I think is the most important message that needs to be heard by humanity? And it's really just one line. You are a human being created in the image of God. You have a purpose in this world that was crafted specifically for you. And that ultimately, the rest is commentary, as they say. That's getting back to that initial soul root, who we are, that we are creations of God. We are godliness that is spending some time in a physical world that has a distinct purpose of its place and its circle of influence to correct and rectify and perfect. We and only we could do that. Not anyone else who has ever lived, not everyone else living today, anywhere, or ever lived or ever will live, can correct that piece of the puzzle. So we have a very big and important mission in this world, and it behooves us, because of that, to get more in sync with what that is and discover where we fit in that divine plan.
Well said. All right. And where do we send our listener or viewer to learn more from you?
Sure. So if a person is of the Jewish faith or not of the Jewish faith and wants to learn the spiritual wisdom of the Torah, you can go to ARC program, like Noah's Ark, ARK, arcprogram.org, and we'd love to have you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rabbi Pinchas, and thank you, listener, viewer, for being open-minded and wanting to be a source of light and inspiration in the world and taking action. Thank you for being part of the tribe. We'll catch you in the next episode. In the meantime, have a fantastic week. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off. If you want to hear more conversations like this on ancient mysteries and spiritual wisdom, then I recommend episode 134 with Rabbi Daniel Lappin, episode 400 with Rabbi Chaim Miller, and episode 500 with me and my wife, Orion. Also, I invite you to check out the show notes, transcript, action-based checklist, and all the URLs mentioned in this interview with Rabbi Pinchas Taylor at getyourselfoptimized.com/507. If you enjoyed the conversation, I encourage you to share the episode and, more importantly, the entire show, Get Yourself Optimized, with a friend. Change a life and help me spread the light. Thank you.